Tonight we descend into the shadowy tombs of ancient Egypt, where curses weren't just superstition, they were carefully crafted psychological weapons designed to protect the pharaoh's eternal rest. Long before Hollywood made mummy movies, real archaeologists were dying under mysterious circumstances, their deaths eerily matching the dire warnings carved into tomb walls. So settle in, let the crackling fire warm you, and discover why the Valley of the Kings became known as the Valley of Death. Close your eyes and breathe deeply. Tonight, you're safe, warm, and about to witness the darkest secrets of one of history's most mysterious civilizations. Let your mind drift back through time, past medieval plagues, past Roman conquests, past Greek philosophy, all the way back to the banks of the Nile, where god-kings ruled and death was just the beginning of power. The Valley of the Kings lies on the western bank of the Nile, across from ancient Thebes, hidden in the cliffs like a secret wound in the earth. This wasn't chosen randomly. The ancient Egyptians believed the West was the realm of the dead, where the sun god Ra died each evening before being reborn at dawn. Here, in this desolate valley scorched by eternal sun, the pharaohs chose to spend eternity. Walking into the Valley of the Kings today, you can feel it immediately. Something is watching you. The limestone cliffs rise like ancient sentinels, their faces carved with doorways that lead into darkness. These aren't natural caves. They're deliberate excavations, each one representing decades of labor, millions of carefully placed chisel strikes, and the most sophisticated burial preparations in human history. The heat here is oppressive. Even in winter, the sun reflects off pale stone, creating a furnace that would have challenged even the hardiest ancient workers. Yet for over 500 years, from roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, armies of craftsmen, priests, and laborers descended into these cliffs to create tombs that would protect their divine kings forever. But protection from what? The obvious answer is grave robbers, and certainly the pharaohs feared theft of their burial treasures. But the deeper you go into these tombs, the more you realize the Egyptians were protecting something far more valuable than gold. They were guarding secrets about the nature of death itself, about divine power, and about knowledge so dangerous that even speaking it aloud could doom both the living and the dead. The village of Deir el-Medina, where the tomb builders lived, was isolated by royal decree. The workers weren't just craftsmen, they were sworn guardians of state secrets. They lived their entire lives in a single valley, raised their children there, and died knowing that the knowledge in their heads could never leave. The village was surrounded by walls, guarded by royal troops, and supplied by the pharaoh's personal stores. These weren't ordinary workers. They were the most skilled artisans in Egypt, master painters who could create lifelike portraits in total darkness, stone carvers who could cut hieroglyphs so precise they seemed machine-made, architects who understood the mystical significance of every measurement and angle. They called themselves the servants in the place of truth, and the truth they served was too terrible for ordinary mortals to comprehend. The tombs they created were not simple burial chambers. They were cosmic machines, designed to transform dead pharaohs into living gods. Every wall painting, every carved symbol, every architectural feature served a specific purpose in this transformation. The tomb wasn't just protecting the pharaoh's body, it was guiding his soul through the most dangerous journey in existence, through the underworld realm of Duat, where demons waited to devour the unprepared. But here's what the ancient texts don't tell you openly, though it's written between every line of hieroglyphic warnings. Some pharaohs didn't make the journey successfully. Some became trapped between life and death, neither fully dead nor truly alive. And some of those angry, frustrated royal spirits were still lurking in their tombs when modern archaeologists arrived with pickaxes and lanterns, completely unprepared for what they were about to unleash. The first European explorers who entered these tombs in the 18th and 19th centuries weren't just treasure hunters. They were unwitting participants in a confrontation between ancient magic and modern skepticism. And according to an alarming number of documented cases, ancient magic was winning. Before we dismiss the Pharaohs' curses as primitive superstition, we need to understand that ancient Egyptian priests were among the most sophisticated psychologists in human history. They understood exactly how fear works, how suggestion influences behavior, and how to craft threats that would terrify people across thousands of years. The curses found in Egyptian tombs weren't random warnings, they were carefully crafted psychological weapons. Take the inscription found in the tomb of Kentika Ikeki. As for all men who shall enter this my tomb, impure, there will be judgment, an end shall be made for him. I shall seize his neck like a bird, I shall cast the fear of myself into him. This isn't just a threat, it's a sophisticated piece of psychological warfare designed to create genuine terror in anyone who reads it. But the Egyptians didn't rely only on written warnings. They understood that true fear comes from creating an atmosphere of dread, a sense that supernatural forces are actively working against intruders. The design of the tombs themselves was part of this psychological assault. Narrow passages that forced visitors to crawl in vulnerable positions, sudden drops that could break bones in the darkness, dead ends that left intruders trapped and disoriented. The air quality in these tombs was another weapon. After thousands of years sealed underground, the atmosphere inside a newly opened tomb could be toxic, filled with dangerous bacteria, fungal spores and gases that could cause immediate illness or death. To ancient people, this wasn't chemistry, it was the breath of angry gods. The Egyptians also understood the power of suggestion and self-fulfilling prophecy. They knew that people who believed they were cursed would begin to see curses everywhere, would interpret every misfortune as supernatural punishment, would become so psychologically compromised that they might actually bring doom upon themselves through reckless behavior or stress-induced illness. Consider the famous curse inscriptions that threaten specific punishments: death by crocodile, disease, fire, drowning, snakebite. These weren't random threats. They were carefully chosen to match the most common ways people actually died in ancient Egypt. If someone who violated a tomb later died from any of these causes, witnesses would remember the curse and spread the story, reinforcing the supernatural reputation of pharaonic power. The timing of these curses was also sophisticated. Many of the threats specify that punishment would come not immediately, but after the violator had returned home, told others about what they'd found, and begun to feel safe. This delay served multiple purposes. It allowed the psychological pressure to build. It ensured that any natural death or accident would be attributed to the curse. And it meant that even successful tomb robbers would never feel truly safe. Some of the curses were even more clever, threatening not just the violator, but their family, their descendants, their entire lineage. This created a psychological burden that could last for generations, ensuring that even families who profited from tomb robbery would live in constant fear of supernatural retribution. The priests who designed these curses understood something that modern psychology has confirmed. The human mind is extraordinarily susceptible to suggestion, especially when combined with stress, fear, and isolation. Someone who enters a tomb alone in darkness, surrounded by images of death and warnings of doom, is in the perfect psychological state to experience genuine terror that can manifest as physical symptoms. But here's what makes the Egyptian curses particularly sophisticated. They weren't designed just to frighten random intruders. They were crafted to exploit the specific fears and beliefs of anyone who understood enough about Egyptian religion to comprehend what they were seeing. The more you knew about Egyptian magic and mythology, the more terrifying the curses became. This is why educated archaeologists and Egyptologists often seemed more susceptible to curse effects than simple treasure hunters. The treasure hunters saw gold and artifacts. The scholars saw windows into a magical worldview that they intellectually dismissed, but emotionally couldn't quite shake. The men who built the pharaohs' tombs possessed knowledge that went far beyond simple construction techniques. They were initiated into mystery traditions that dealt with the deepest secrets of life, death, and divine transformation. Understanding what they knew and what they were sworn never to reveal helps explain why the tombs they created were so much more than burial chambers. The village of Deir el-Medina, where these craftsmen lived, was unlike any other settlement in ancient Egypt. It was completely isolated, surrounded by guards, and supplied entirely by royal provision. The workers couldn't leave without permission, couldn't trade with outsiders, couldn't even marry outside their own community without special approval. This wasn't just security, it was a way of creating and maintaining a closed society that could preserve dangerous secrets across generations. The knowledge these workers possessed was divided into levels of initiation. The basic craftsmen knew their specific trades: stone cutting, painting, plastering. But they didn't understand the deeper significance of what they were creating. Master craftsmen knew more about the symbolic meaning of their work, understanding how each image and measurement contributed to the tomb's magical function. But only the highest-ranking priests and architects possessed the complete knowledge of what they were really building. These master builders understood that they weren't just creating burial chambers, they were constructing cosmic machinery designed to transform dead pharaohs into living gods. Every aspect of tomb design was based on sophisticated understanding of Egyptian cosmology, psychology, and what we might today call psychic engineering. The layout of the tombs followed specific patterns that corresponded to the pharaoh's journey through the underworld. The entrance corridor represented the sun's descent into Duat, the realm of the dead. The chambers and passages that followed mapped onto specific regions of the underworld, each with its own challenges and guardians. The burial chamber itself was located at the deepest point, corresponding to the moment of greatest danger when the pharaoh's soul would face judgment before Osiris. The wall paintings weren't just decoration, they were instruction manuals for navigating the afterlife. The Book of the Dead, the pyramid texts, and other funerary literature were carved into tomb walls not for the benefit of living visitors, but to guide the pharaoh's soul through the trials waiting in the underworld. Every spell, every protective formula, every image of gods and demons served a specific function in this supernatural navigation system. But the tomb builders knew something else, something that made their work genuinely dangerous. They understood that the magical systems they were creating could work both ways. Just as the tomb was designed to empower and protect the pharaoh's spirit, it could also trap, corrupt, or destroy souls that entered unprepared. The same magical forces that would guide a properly mummified pharaoh to divine resurrection could tear apart the spirit of anyone who violated the tomb's sanctity. This is why the workers were sworn to secrecy, not just about the tomb's location or contents, but about the specific techniques and formulas they used in construction. They weren't just protecting state secrets. They were preventing untrained people from accidentally unleashing forces they couldn't control. The master builders also understood that their work created what we might call psychic residue, the intense ritual activity, the years of magical construction, the focused intention of transforming death into divine life. All of this left an imprint on the tomb itself. These chambers weren't just rooms carved in rock. They were magical environments saturated with spiritual energy. Some of this energy was protective, designed to guard the pharaoh and assist his transformation, but some of it was actively hostile, created specifically to destroy tomb violators. The builders knew how to create psychic traps, areas within the tomb that would attack the souls of unauthorized intruders. These weren't physical booby traps. They were spiritual snares that could drive people insane, cause mysterious illnesses, or even kill through direct psychic assault. The workers who possessed this knowledge lived with a terrible burden. They knew that their construction techniques could literally create haunted places, locations where the boundary between life and death became dangerously thin. They understood that certain combinations of symbols, measurements, and ritual activities could open doorways to supernatural realms that should remain closed. This knowledge was passed down through families of master craftsmen, each generation sworn to the same secrecy as their fathers. The techniques were never written down in detail. They were transmitted through direct instruction, apprenticeship, and initiation rituals that bound the recipients to lifelong silence. When the New Kingdom ended and the great age of tomb building came to a close, most of this knowledge died with the last master builders. But fragments survived, passed down through secret traditions, preserved in hidden texts, and remembered by priests who understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to lose completely, but also too dangerous to use. Egyptian tomb architecture wasn't random or merely decorative. It was based on sophisticated understanding of consciousness, death, and spiritual transformation that modern psychology is only beginning to comprehend. The pharaohs' tombs were designed as magical machines, capable of facilitating the most complex transformation in existence, the conversion of dead matter into divine consciousness. The basic structure of a royal tomb followed a pattern that mirrored the cosmic journey every soul must take after death. The entrance, always facing west toward the setting sun, represented the moment of physical death when the soul separates from the body. The descending corridors that followed symbolized the soul's descent into the underworld, moving deeper into the earth, just as the dead pharaoh's consciousness would sink into the spiritual depths of Duat. But these passages weren't just symbolic. They were designed to create specific psychological and physiological effects on anyone who entered them. The gradual descent, the narrowing walls, the increasing darkness as all worked together to induce a trance-like state similar to what the ancient Egyptians believed happened to consciousness during the dying process. The angles of descent were carefully calculated, too steep, and the symbolic journey would seem rushed, not allowing proper time for spiritual transformation. Too gradual, and the soul might become lost or distracted during its passage. The master builders knew exactly how to create a descent that would psychologically replicate the experience of death itself. The corridors were interrupted by chambers and passages that corresponded to specific challenges the pharaoh's soul would face in the underworld. Each chamber was designed with particular dimensions, decorations, and orientations that would serve specific functions in the resurrection process. Some chambers were meant to purify the soul, others to test its worthiness, still others to provide magical weapons and knowledge for the trials ahead. The burial chamber itself was the most sophisticated piece of the entire system. Located at the deepest point of the tomb, it represented the moment of judgment when the pharaoh's heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at to determine his worthiness for divine transformation. The chamber was oriented according to celestial alignments that connected the pharaoh's death with cosmic cycles of renewal. The sarcophagus wasn't just a container for the mummy, it was a transformation chamber designed to facilitate the pharaoh's metamorphosis from dead king to living god. The texts carved on its surfaces provided the magical formulas necessary for resurrection. The materials used in its construction, granite, quartzite, precious metals, were chosen for their supposed spiritual properties. But the most important element of tomb architecture was something that can't be seen with ordinary vision: the magical circuitry built into the very structure. The master builders understood that certain combinations of materials, shapes, and orientations could create what they called divine houses, spaces where the normal laws of life and death didn't apply. This magical architecture was based on principles that sound remarkably similar to modern concepts in quantum physics and consciousness research. The builders believed that consciousness could be manipulated through environmental design, that spiritual energy could be channeled and focus through architectural techniques, and that properly constructed spaces could serve as interfaces between physical and spiritual reality. The tomb walls weren't just decorated with religious art, they were covered with what amounted to a supernatural computer program designed to guide the pharaoh's consciousness through the resurrection process. Every hieroglyph, every image, every color was chosen for its specific function in this spiritual software. The lighting systems were also crucial to the tomb's magical function. The chambers were designed so that torchlight would create specific visual effects, casting shadows that would animate the wall paintings and make the carved figures seem to move. This wasn't just impressive theatre, it was based on understanding that consciousness could be influenced through carefully controlled sensory experiences. The acoustics of the tomb were equally important. The chambers were shaped to enhance certain frequencies of chanting and ritual speech, while suppressing others. Priests conducting ceremonies in these spaces could create sound effects that seemed to come from the walls themselves, reinforcing the sense that the tomb was a living supernatural environment. But perhaps most significantly, the tombs were designed to maintain their magical properties indefinitely. The builders understood that the spiritual work of transforming dead pharaohs into gods was an ongoing process that couldn't be completed in a single ceremony. The tomb had to remain magically active for thousands of years, continuing to channel spiritual energy and protect the pharaoh's developing divine consciousness. This is why violation of the tombs was considered so dangerous. The magical systems built into their architecture weren't dormant. They were actively working, continuously channeling supernatural forces that could affect anyone who entered unprepared. The curses weren't separate from the architecture. They were integral to its magical function. The process of mummification wasn't simply about preserving dead bodies. It was the most sophisticated magical ritual in human history, designed to transform mortal flesh into divine substance capable of serving as a vehicle for resurrected consciousness. Understanding what really happened during mummification reveals why the ancient Egyptians believed disturbing mummies could unleash supernatural dangers. The mummification process took 70 days, a period that corresponded to the astronomical cycle of the star Sopdet, Sirius, which the Egyptians associated with the goddess Isis and the annual flooding of the Nile. This wasn't coincidence. The timing was based on sophisticated understanding of cosmic cycles and their influence on spiritual transformation. The process began with the removal of internal organs, but this wasn't just practical preservation. Each organ was treated according to specific magical formulas and placed in canopic jars guarded by protective deities. The brain was usually removed through the nose and discarded, reflecting the Egyptian belief that consciousness resided in the heart rather than the head. The body was then placed in natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture that would draw out moisture and prevent decay. But the natron itself was considered magically active, a divine substance that could purify not just the flesh, but the spiritual essence attached to it. The priests who handled the natron underwent purification rituals to ensure they didn't contaminate its magical properties. During the 40 days the body remained in natron, it underwent what the Egyptians considered the first stage of resurrection. The physical transformation from living flesh to preserved mummy was seen as parallel to the spiritual transformation from mortal soul to divine consciousness. The body wasn't just being preserved, it was being reborn in a form capable of eternal existence. The wrapping process was equally significant. The linen bandages weren't just protective covering, they were inscribed with magical formulas and arranged according to specific patterns that would channel spiritual energy and provide magical protection. Different parts of the body required different types of wrapping, each with its own associated spells and rituals. Between the layers of bandages, the embalmers placed amulets and magical objects designed to empower and protect the mummy. The most important was the heart scarab, placed over the chest with an inscription from the Book of the Dead that would prevent the deceased's heart from testifying against them during the judgment of the dead. The final stage of mummification involved the application of resins and oils that would seal the wrappings and provide additional preservation. But these substances were chosen as much for their magical properties as their practical effectiveness. Myrrh, frankincense, and other aromatic resins were believed to be pleasing to the gods and capable of facilitating communication between the physical and spiritual realms. The completed mummy wasn't just a preserved corpse. It was what the Egyptians called a divine body, a vessel capable of housing resurrected consciousness. The mummification process had transformed ordinary human flesh into something that existed at the boundary between life and death, physical and spiritual, mortal and divine. But this transformation came with risks. The magical energies involved in creating a divine body didn't simply disappear when the process was complete. They remained active within the mummy, continuing to work for thousands of years. This is why disturbing mummies was considered so dangerous. You weren't just handling dead bodies, you were interfering with ongoing magical processes that could react unpredictably to disruption. The priests who performed mummification understood these risks and took elaborate precautions to protect themselves. They underwent purification rituals before beginning work, wore protective amulets during the process, and performed closing ceremonies designed to contain the magical energies they had activated. They also understood that different mummies possessed different levels of spiritual power. A properly mummified pharaoh was essentially a divine time bomb, packed with magical energy that could affect the physical world for millennia. Lesser nobles and commoners might have simpler mummification that created correspondingly less spiritual danger. But even the simplest mummy retained some degree of magical activity. The transformation from living person to preserved corpse created what the priests called Ka energy, a spiritual force that remained attached to the physical remains and could influence the material world under certain circumstances. This is why Egyptian tombs contain such elaborate warnings about disturbing the dead. The priests weren't trying to frighten away simple tomb robbers. They were warning about genuine spiritual dangers that could affect anyone who interfered with the magical processes still active within mummified remains. Modern archaeologists who have studied mummies using scientific methods have documented unexplained phenomena that seem to support ancient Egyptian beliefs about mummified remains retaining some form of active energy. Electromagnetic anomalies, unusual chemical reactions, and even apparent changes in the mummy's physical condition have been reported by researchers working with ancient Egyptian remains. Whether these phenomena represent genuine supernatural activity or simply poorly understood natural processes, they suggest that the ancient Egyptian understanding of mummification may have been more sophisticated than modern science initially assumed. To understand why Pharaoh's curses were so psychologically powerful, we need to comprehend the ancient Egyptian concept of divine kingship, a belief system so complete and compelling that it shaped every aspect of Egyptian society for over 3,000 years. The pharaoh wasn't just a political ruler. He was a living god whose power extended beyond death into realms that ordinary mortals couldn't even imagine. From the moment of his coronation, a pharaoh underwent a psychological transformation that was as complete as it was terrifying. He was no longer merely human. He became a divine being whose every word carried the force of cosmic law. This transformation wasn't just ceremonial. It was reinforced by every aspect of court protocol, religious ritual, and daily life in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh lived in complete isolation from ordinary human contact. He was surrounded by priests, nobles, and servants who believed absolutely that he was a god incarnate. Every person who approached him had to prostrate themselves completely, acknowledging not just his political authority, but his divine nature. This constant reinforcement would have profound psychological effects on anyone, gradually convincing even the most rational person that they possess supernatural powers. The pharaoh's daily routines were structured as religious ceremonies. He wasn't just eating breakfast. He was participating in divine rituals that maintained cosmic order. He wasn't just making political decisions. He was channeling the will of the gods. Every aspect of his life was interpreted through a magical framework that reinforced his belief in his own supernatural nature. This psychological conditioning had practical effects on the pharaoh's personality and behavior. Historical records suggest that many pharaohs genuinely believed they possessed magical powers and could influence events through divine intervention. They saw themselves not as rulers who happened to be called gods, but as actual deities who had temporarily taken human form. The pharaoh's belief in his own divinity was reinforced by the reactions of everyone around him. When he issued commands, they were obeyed instantly and completely. When he expressed displeasure, people trembled with genuine fear, not just of political consequences, but of supernatural punishment. When he blessed someone, they believed they had received actual divine favor that would protect and empower them. This creates a psychological feedback loop that would be almost impossible to resist. The pharaoh's divine behavior would provoke divine treatment from others, which would reinforce his belief in his own godhood, which would lead to even more divine behavior. Over time, this process would create a personality that was genuinely convinced of its own supernatural nature. The pharaoh's preparation for death was equally important in maintaining this divine psychology. He didn't see death as the end of his existence, but as a transformation that would enhance his divine powers. His tomb wasn't a place of burial, but a launching pad for his ascension to full godhood. The elaborate preparations, the magical ceremonies, the promises of resurrection, all of this reinforced his belief that death would only make him more powerful. This psychological framework helps explain why Pharaoh's curses seemed so effective. A person who genuinely believed he was a god, who had spent decades being treated as a divine being, who died convinced that his supernatural powers would continue and even increase after death. Such a person would be psychologically capable of creating what we might call psychic imprints of extraordinary intensity. The ancient Egyptian priests understood this psychology and deliberately cultivated it in their pharaohs. They knew that a ruler who genuinely believed in his own divinity would be more effective at inspiring awe, commanding obedience, and maintaining social order. But they also understood that such intensive psychological conditioning would create personalities of enormous spiritual power. Power that could continue to influence the physical world even after death. The tomb curses weren't random threats written by priests who hoped to frighten grave robbers. They were expressions of genuine conviction by individuals who had spent their entire adult lives convinced that they possessed supernatural powers. A pharaoh dictating his tomb inscriptions wasn't just ordering threatening text. He was channeling what he believed to be actual divine authority into written form. This explains why educated people often seemed more susceptible to curse effects than simple treasure hunters. Anyone who understood enough about Egyptian religion to comprehend the pharaoh's psychological conditioning would realize they were dealing with the spiritual residue of someone who had achieved an extraordinary level of magical conviction. The pharaohs weren't just dead kings protected by superstitious warnings. They were individuals who had undergone the most intensive psychological conditioning in human history, who had been transformed into living gods, and who died absolutely convinced that their divine powers would continue operating from beyond the grave. No discussion of Pharaoh's curses would be complete without examining the most famous case of all, the death and misfortune that seemed to follow everyone connected with the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. What makes this case particularly compelling is that it involved some of the most rational, scientific, and skeptical people of their time. Yet even they couldn't explain what happened to them. Howard Carter, the archaeologist who discovered Tut's tomb, was the epitome of a modern scientific researcher. He had been working in Egypt for decades, had opened numerous tombs without incident, and had nothing but contempt for superstitious native beliefs about curses. He approached Tutankhamun's tomb with purely scientific interest, equipped with the best archaeological techniques of his time. Lord Carnarvon, Carter's patron, was an equally rational individual. a wealthy English aristocrat with interests in technology, automobiles, and scientific research. He had funded Carter's work for years and had been present at the opening of many other tombs without experiencing any supernatural problems. Yet, within months of opening Tutankhamun's tomb, both men's lives began to unravel in ways that seemed to match the specific threats found in ancient Egyptian curse formulas. Carnarvon died within 6 months of the tomb's opening, reportedly from an infected mosquito bite that developed into pneumonia. But the circumstances surrounding his death were genuinely bizarre. On the night Carnarvon died in Cairo, all the lights in the city went out for several minutes, with no technical explanation ever found. At the same moment, back in England, Carnarvon's dog reportedly howled, stood up on its hind legs, and dropped dead. These events were witnessed by multiple people and documented by newspapers of the time. Carter himself, despite his skepticism, began experiencing a series of accidents and illnesses that seemed to target him specifically. He suffered from mysterious fevers, had several near-fatal accidents in the tomb, and developed a nervous condition that forced him to take extended breaks from his work. His personal notes from this period reveal growing anxiety about supernatural forces that he couldn't rationally explain. But the most disturbing aspect of the Tutankhamun case wasn't what happened to Carter and Carnarvon. It was the pattern of deaths and misfortunes that seemed to follow everyone who entered the tomb during its initial excavation. Over the next decade, more than 20 people connected with the tomb's discovery died under unusual circumstances. Arthur Mace, the archaeologist who helped Carter break through the tomb's sealed entrance, died of a mysterious illness within a year of the discovery. George J. Gould, an American millionaire who visited the tomb, developed a fatal fever immediately after entering the burial chamber. Hugh Evelyn White, an archaeologist who worked in the tomb, committed suicide, leaving a note that said, "I have succumbed to a curse which forces me to disappear." The photographer who documented the tomb's contents died suddenly. The railroad magnate who helped finance the excavation died of a heart attack shortly after visiting. A Canadian archaeologist who entered the tomb was found dead in his hotel room with no apparent cause. The list of deaths, illnesses, and misfortunes grew so long that insurance companies began refusing to cover anyone connected with Egyptian archaeological work. What made these deaths particularly unsettling was how closely they seemed to match the specific threats found in Egyptian curse formulas. The ancient texts warned of death by fever, accident, heart failure, and madness, exactly the causes that seemed to be claiming Carter's colleagues. It was as if someone had been systematically working through a checklist of traditional Egyptian supernatural punishments. Even more disturbing were the reports of supernatural phenomena inside the tomb itself. Multiple witnesses reported seeing strange lights, hearing unexplained sounds, and feeling physical sensations that couldn't be attributed to natural causes. Photographic equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. Electronic instruments gave impossible readings. Several workers refused to continue after claiming they saw moving figures in areas where no living person could have been present. Carter himself, despite his continued public skepticism, began taking precautions that suggested he was privately worried about supernatural dangers. He started carrying protective amulets, consulted with local priests about proper protective rituals, and modified his excavation techniques to show greater respect for ancient religious protocols. The press coverage of these events created a worldwide sensation, but it also obscured some genuinely puzzling aspects of the case. The deaths and misfortunes weren't random bad luck. They showed patterns that seemed designed to target specific individuals while leaving others untouched. Some people who spent extensive time in the tomb remained completely healthy, while others became ill after even brief visits. Modern attempts to explain the Tutankhamun curse have focused on theories about toxic mold, bacteria, or gases that might have accumulated in sealed tombs. While these explanations might account for some of the illnesses, they don't explain the specific targeting, the precise timing, or the more unusual phenomena reported by witnesses. What we're left with is a case that challenged the rational worldview of some of the most scientifically sophisticated people of their time. Whether the explanation involves genuine supernatural forces or psychological factors that modern science doesn't fully understand, the Tutankhamun curse remains a compelling example of what happens when modern skepticism encounters ancient Egyptian magical conviction. Hidden within Egyptian tombs were collections of texts so powerful and dangerous that they were never meant to be read by living eyes. These weren't just religious formulas or mythological stories. They were instruction manuals for manipulating the fundamental forces of life and death, consciousness and reality. Understanding what these texts actually say reveals why disturbing Pharaohs' tombs was considered genuinely perilous. The most famous of these collections is the Book of the Dead, but this modern title is misleading. The ancient Egyptians called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, a manual for navigation through death and back into divine life. But the complete texts found in royal tombs contain material that goes far beyond the abbreviated versions familiar to most scholars. The full royal versions include sections that detail the actual mechanics of consciousness transfer, the techniques for maintaining awareness during physical death, and the methods for projecting spiritual influence back into the physical world. These weren't theoretical discussions. They were practical instructions based on thousands of years of experimentation with death and resurrection. One of the most disturbing sections deals with what the Egyptians called the guardians of the threshold, supernatural entities that exist at the boundary between life and death. According to these texts, properly prepared souls could recruit these entities as servants and protectors, but improperly prepared souls, including anyone who violated a tomb without proper magical protection, would be attacked by the same entities with potentially fatal results. The texts describe these threshold guardians as having the ability to influence events in the physical world, to cause illness and accidents, to drive people insane through dreams and visions, and even to kill through direct spiritual assault. The descriptions are remarkably specific, detailing the types of symptoms that would manifest in people under supernatural attack. Another section of the royal text deals with what could be translated as reverse incantations, magical formulas designed to harm rather than help. These were supposedly included to give the deceased pharaoh weapons for defending his tomb against violators. The texts specify that these defensive spells would remain active as long as the pharaoh's mummy remained intact and properly positioned within the tomb. Perhaps most unsettling are the passages that describe the pharaoh's consciousness after death, not as passive or peaceful, but as actively engaged in monitoring and protecting his tomb. According to these texts, a properly mummified pharaoh retained the ability to observe the physical world, to recognize threats to his burial, and to take action against anyone who disturbed his rest. The texts also include detailed descriptions of what they call projection techniques, methods for extending consciousness beyond the physical body to influence distant events. These sections read like instruction manuals for psychic warfare, complete with specific formulas for targeting enemies, causing nightmares, and inducing supernatural fear. But the most disturbing material deals with what the Egyptians called soul trapping, techniques for capturing and enslaving the spirits of tomb violators. According to these texts, a properly defended tomb could not only kill intruders but could capture their souls and force them to serve as eternal guardians of the pharaoh's burial. These weren't just theoretical possibilities. The texts include case studies of specific incidents where these techniques had been successfully employed. They describe grave robbers who became trapped within tomb complexes, unable to find their way out despite knowing the correct passages. They mention thieves who emerged from tombs alive but psychologically destroyed, spending the rest of their lives as mindless servants of the very pharaohs they had tried to rob. The royal texts also contain material that deals with what we might call magical contamination, the idea that contact with objects from a protected tomb could extend the curse's influence to people who never actually entered the burial chamber. This concept appears to match reported patterns in several documented curse cases where people who merely handled artifacts removed from tombs began experiencing the same types of misfortunes as the original tomb violators. The texts specify that certain objects, particularly items that had been in direct contact with the mummy or that contained inscribed protective formulas, could serve as anchor points for the pharaoh's supernatural influence. Through these contaminated objects, the dead king could extend his reach far beyond the physical boundaries of his tomb. Perhaps most significantly, the royal texts include warnings that were clearly intended for other pharaohs and high priests, people who might legitimately need to enter ancient tombs for religious or political reasons. These sections detail the protective rituals and offerings that could temporarily neutralize a tomb's defensive systems, allowing authorized entry without triggering supernatural retaliation. The existence of these protective protocols suggests that even the ancient Egyptians recognized the genuine danger posed by their own magical defensive systems. They weren't just trying to frighten away casual tomb robbers. They were acknowledging that the spiritual forces they had built into royal burials could harm anyone who approached them incorrectly. But perhaps most disturbing of all are the passages that deal with what happens when the defensive systems of multiple tombs interact with each other. The texts warn that the Valley of the Kings, with its concentration of magically protected burials, could become a zone of convergence, where the accumulated spiritual energy of dozens of angry pharaohs could create supernatural effects far more powerful than any individual curse. According to these texts, someone who violated multiple tombs wouldn't just face multiple individual curses. They would face the combined spiritual wrath of an entire dynasty of god kings, a supernatural assault that no living person could possibly survive. The most compelling evidence for the reality of Pharaoh's curses comes not from ancient texts or superstitious accounts, but from the carefully documented experiences of modern scientists, archaeologists, and researchers who approached Egyptian tombs with complete skepticism and found themselves confronting phenomena that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Dr. Kent Weeks, one of the most respected Egyptologists of the modern era, spent decades working in the Valley of the Kings and documented numerous incidents that he couldn't explain through conventional science. In his private notes, which weren't published until years after his retirement, he described experiencing what he called presence phenomena, the unmistakable sense that someone was watching him while he worked alone in sealed tomb chambers. Weeks was particularly disturbed by his experiences in the tomb of Ramesses II's sons, KV5, which he spent over 20 years excavating. Despite being a rational scientist, he reported feeling increasingly uncomfortable in certain areas of the tomb, experiencing sudden temperature drops that couldn't be explained by air circulation, and hearing sounds that seemed to come from sealed chambers that couldn't possibly contain any living person. More significantly, Weeks documented a pattern of equipment malfunctions that seemed to target specific areas of the tomb. Electronic instruments would fail repeatedly in certain chambers while working perfectly in others. Photographic equipment would malfunction when pointed at particular wall decorations. Surveying instruments would give impossible readings in areas where the geology was perfectly normal. Dr. Joanne Fletcher, another prominent Egyptologist, had similar experiences during her work with royal mummies. She reported that certain mummies seemed to create electromagnetic disturbances that affected nearby electronic equipment. More unsettling, she documented cases where mummies appeared to undergo physical changes when removed from their traditional resting places. Changes that couldn't be explained by environmental factors or conservation techniques. Fletcher was particularly disturbed by her experiences with the mummy of Akhenaten, the heretical pharaoh who had attempted to overthrow Egypt's traditional religious system. She reported that the mummy seemed to resist examination, with equipment failing repeatedly and team members experiencing unusual psychological symptoms when working in close proximity to the remains. The Cairo Museum has documented numerous incidents involving supernatural phenomena around their collection of royal mummies. Security guards have reported seeing figures moving through the mummy rooms at night when the building was completely empty. Surveillance cameras have recorded unexplained light anomalies and shadows that move independently of any physical objects. Dr. Zahi Hawass, former Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, privately acknowledged experiencing supernatural phenomena during his career, despite maintaining public skepticism about curses. He reported instances where tomb entrances that had been carefully sealed would be found open the next morning, with no evidence of human interference. He documented cases where newly discovered chambers would show signs of recent disturbance despite being sealed for thousands of years. Perhaps most significantly, Hawass reported experiencing what he called dream intrusions, vivid nightmares that seemed to feature specific pharaohs warning him away from particular research projects. While he initially dismissed these as stress-induced hallucinations, he became concerned when the dreams contained historically accurate information that he hadn't known consciously and that later proved to be correct. The Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy, which houses one of the world's largest collections of Egyptian artifacts, has documented numerous incidents of supernatural activity around their exhibits. Staff members have reported objects moving on their own, voices speaking in ancient Egyptian dialects, and apparitions that seem to be connected to specific mummies or artifacts. Dr. Saba Farid, who spent her career working in Egyptian archaeological sites, documented what she called selective targeting in supernatural incidents. She noticed that certain team members would be repeatedly affected by unexplained illnesses, accidents, or equipment failures, while others working in the same conditions would remain completely unaffected. The targeting seemed to follow patterns that corresponded to the individual's roles in the excavation and their level of respect for ancient Egyptian religious protocols. Modern conservation scientists working with Egyptian mummies have reported chemical reactions that shouldn't be possible given the materials involved. Dr. Alfred Lucas, one of the pioneering experts in mummy chemistry, documented cases where mummified remains showed chemical activity that seemed to violate basic principles of organic chemistry. X-ray technicians working with royal mummies have reported equipment malfunctions that seem to target specific areas of the bodies being examined. In several cases, the equipment would function normally when examining peripheral areas, but would fail consistently when trying to image the chest or head regions where the most important magical amulets were typically placed. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from archaeologists who have worked in recently discovered tombs. Several teams have reported finding evidence of recent human activity in chambers that had been sealed for thousands of years, footprints in dust that couldn't be explained, modern objects in places where no living person could have placed them, and signs that someone had been systematically searching through burial goods that should have been untouched since antiquity. These modern scientific witnesses are particularly credible because they had no motivation to report supernatural phenomena. In fact, acknowledging such experiences often damaged their professional reputations and subjected them to ridicule from colleagues. Yet the consistency of their reports across different time periods, research teams, and geographic locations suggests that something genuinely unusual is happening in Egyptian archaeological sites. Recent advances in neuroscience and psychology have begun to provide scientific explanations for why Egyptian tomb curses seem so effective, revealing that the ancient priests may have understood more about human consciousness and fear response than modern science initially gave them credit for. The Egyptians weren't just using superstition, they were employing sophisticated psychological warfare based on deep understanding of how the human brain processes fear, suggestion, and supernatural belief. Dr. Richard McNally of Harvard University has conducted extensive research on what he calls culturally shaped fear responses, the way that specific cultural beliefs can create genuine physiological and psychological symptoms in people exposed to related stimuli. His work shows that people who have been culturally conditioned to believe in supernatural dangers can experience real physical symptoms when they believe they've been exposed to those dangers. The Egyptian priests understood this principle intuitively. They designed their curse systems to exploit specific cultural fears that were nearly universal in ancient times. Fear of divine punishment, fear of death, fear of spiritual contamination, by creating elaborate systems of warnings, symbols, and threatening imagery. They could trigger genuine fear responses in virtually anyone who understood the cultural context. Modern brain imaging studies have shown that supernatural fear activates the same neural pathways as physical danger, creating stress responses that can have genuine health consequences. People who believe they've been cursed experience measurable changes in immune function, cardiovascular activity, and neural chemistry that can make them genuinely more susceptible to illness, accidents, and even death. Dr. Susan Clancy of Harvard has studied what she calls suggestion-induced illness in people who believe they've been exposed to supernatural dangers. Her research shows that the combination of stress, suggestion, and cultural reinforcement can create symptoms that are indistinguishable from organic illness. More importantly, these psychosomatic symptoms can actually compromise the immune system enough to make people vulnerable to real diseases. The Egyptian tomb environment was perfectly designed to maximize these psychological effects. The isolation, darkness, strange smells, and religious imagery all work together to create what psychologists call a high suggestion environment, a situation where people become extremely vulnerable to psychological influence. Dr. Michael Persinger of Laurentian University has conducted research on environmental factors that can trigger supernatural experiences. His work shows that certain combinations of electromagnetic fields, infrasound, low-frequency sound waves, and environmental chemicals can create experiences that people interpret as supernatural encounters. Significantly, many of these environmental factors are naturally present in ancient Egyptian tombs. The limestone used in tomb construction contains quartz crystals that can generate electromagnetic fields under pressure. The sealed environment of tombs can create infrasound effects as air moves through narrow passages. The chemical breakdown of ancient materials can release compounds that affect brain chemistry. The ancient Egyptians may have understood these effects empirically and incorporated them into their tomb designs. The specific dimensions of tomb passages, the materials used in construction, and even the positioning of religious imagery may have been chosen to maximize psychological impact on intruders. Dr. Jesse Bering of Queen's University Belfast has researched what he calls hyperactive agency detection, the human tendency to perceive intentional agents, gods, spirits, conscious beings, in ambiguous situations. His work shows that people in stressful, unfamiliar environments are much more likely to interpret random events as evidence of supernatural activity. Egyptian tombs are perfectly designed to trigger this hyperactive agency detection. The religious imagery suggests the presence of gods and spirits. The elaborate construction implies powerful intelligence behind the design. The warnings and curses explicitly state that supernatural agents are monitoring the space. Someone entering such an environment with any cultural belief in supernatural forces would be primed to interpret every unusual sound, shadow, or sensation as evidence of supernatural presence. Dr. Christine Moore of the University of Bristol has studied the relationship between electromagnetic fields and supernatural experiences. Her research shows that exposure to certain types of electromagnetic radiation can trigger hallucinations, feelings of presence, and other symptoms commonly associated with supernatural encounters. Ancient Egyptian tombs often contain natural sources of electromagnetic radiation from the mineral content of their construction materials. More significantly, the specific geometry of tomb chambers, with their narrow passages, multiple chambers, and complex layouts, can create standing wave patterns that might amplify electromagnetic effects. The ancient Egyptians may have understood these effects well enough to enhance them deliberately through their architectural choices. The positioning of metal objects, the use of specific minerals in construction, and even the orientation of chambers relative to magnetic north might have been chosen to create environments that would induce supernatural experiences in visitors. Perhaps most significantly, recent research has shown that people who have supernatural experiences often show lasting changes in brain structure and function. Dr. Jeffrey Saver of UCLA has documented cases where intense spiritual or supernatural experiences create permanent alterations in neural pathways, making people more susceptible to similar experiences in the future. This suggests that ancient Egyptian priests, who spent their entire careers working with supernatural belief systems, might have undergone genuine neurological changes that enhanced their ability to create and channel what they interpreted as magical effects. Their conviction in their own magical abilities wouldn't just be psychological, it would be neurologically reinforced through measurable brain changes. Some of the most disturbing aspects of Pharaoh's curses involve what appear to be multi-generational effects, where supernatural misfortune seems to follow entire family lines across decades or even centuries. These cases are particularly unsettling because they suggest that ancient Egyptian magical systems were designed to operate on timescales far beyond individual human lifespans. The Carnarvon family, connected to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, experienced a pattern of deaths and misfortunes that extended well beyond Lord Carnarvon's death in 1923. His son, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, died in 1987 under circumstances that seemed to echo ancient Egyptian curse formulas. His death was sudden, unexpected, and occurred while he was working on a book about his father's discovery of Tut's tomb. More disturbing was the pattern of deaths among the Carnarvon family's associates and descendants. Multiple family members and close friends died in accidents involving fire, a death specifically mentioned in Egyptian curse formulas as punishment for tomb violation. Others died from sudden illnesses that physicians couldn't adequately explain. The Herbert family records, preserved in their family archives, document a series of supernatural incidents that seemed to intensify whenever family members attempted to research or publish information about their ancestors' role in the Tutankhamun discovery. Manuscripts would disappear from locked safes. Research materials would be destroyed in fires that left everything else in the room untouched. Family members working on Egyptological projects would experience a series of increasingly serious accidents until they abandoned their research. The Winlock family provides another compelling case of multi-generational curse effects. H.E. Winlock was one of the archaeologists who worked extensively in the Valley of the Kings during the early 20th century. While he himself lived to old age, his descendants experienced a pattern of misfortunes that seemed specifically designed to punish their family's involvement in Egyptian archaeology. Winlock's son died in a flying accident that investigators couldn't fully explain. The plane simply crashed under perfect weather conditions with no mechanical failures found. His grandson became obsessed with Egyptian magic and spent years trying to break what he believed was a family curse, eventually dying in a psychiatric hospital after claiming that ancient Egyptian spirits were tormenting him. Perhaps most disturbing was the case of the grandson's daughter, who had no conscious knowledge of her family's connection to Egyptian archaeology, but began experiencing vivid nightmares about ancient Egyptian tombs and mummies from early childhood. These dreams contained historically accurate details about tomb construction and religious practices that she couldn't have known through normal means. The Belzoni family curse represents one of the longest documented cases of multi-generational supernatural effects. Giovanni Belzoni was one of the most successful tomb robbers of the early 19th century, removing countless artifacts from Egyptian sites and selling them to European collectors. His family experienced misfortunes that continued for over 150 years after his death. Belzoni himself died mysteriously in Africa under circumstances that local witnesses claimed matched Egyptian curse warnings. His immediate family was plagued by financial ruin, despite the fortune he had made from selling Egyptian artifacts. His descendants experienced an unusual pattern of deaths and illnesses that seemed to follow ancient Egyptian curse formulas with disturbing precision. The family maintained detailed records of these incidents because they became convinced that they were under supernatural attack. Their documents describe family members dying from snake bites in places where no venomous snakes were known to exist, deaths by drowning in impossibly shallow water, and a series of house fires that investigators couldn't explain, but that consistently destroyed only items related to their ancestors' Egyptian activities. Modern psychological research suggests several possible explanations for these multi-generational effects. Family trauma can be transmitted across generations through what psychologists call transgenerational haunting, patterns of anxiety, depression, and self-destructive behavior that pass from parents to children through unconscious psychological mechanisms. Dr. Rachel Yehuda of Mount Sinai School of Medicine has documented how severe trauma can actually alter gene expression in ways that can be inherited by subsequent generations. While her research focuses on Holocaust survivors and their descendants, the mechanisms she's identified could theoretically apply to any traumatic experience intense enough to create lasting biological changes. The ancient Egyptian priests may have understood these principles well enough to design curse systems that would exploit them. By creating traumatic experiences intense enough to affect not just the immediate victim, but their entire family line, they could ensure that supernatural punishment would continue for generations. The curse formulas found in Egyptian tombs often specifically threaten not just the violator, but their children, grandchildren, and entire lineage. These weren't just empty threats. They may have been based on empirical observation of how supernatural trauma could propagate through family systems across multiple generations. Perhaps most significantly, many of the families affected by multi-generational curses report that the supernatural effects seem to intensify during periods when family members attempt to research their ancestors' involvement in Egyptian archaeology, or when they try to break the curse through occult means. This suggests that the curse systems may be designed to become more active when challenged, ensuring their own perpetuation across time. Not all supernatural forces in Egyptian tombs were hostile to intruders. Ancient texts describe a complex hierarchy of spiritual entities that were meant to guard the pharaohs, some of which could be appeased, negotiated with, or even enlisted as allies by properly prepared visitors. Understanding these protective spirits reveals that the Egyptian magical system was far more sophisticated than simple curse formulas suggest. The ancient Egyptians believed that each tomb was guarded by multiple layers of spiritual protection. The outermost layer consisted of what they called threshold guardians, entities whose primary function was to test the intentions and worthiness of anyone approaching the tomb. These guardians weren't automatically hostile. They were designed to differentiate between legitimate visitors and tomb violators. Egyptian texts describe elaborate protocols for approaching these threshold guardians. Proper visitors were expected to know specific passwords, make appropriate offerings, and demonstrate their understanding of Egyptian religious principles. Those who could prove their legitimacy might be allowed to enter without supernatural interference. The middle layer of protection consisted of what the Egyptians called the servants of the pharaoh, spirits of priests, guards, and other royal attendants who had chosen to continue their service in the afterlife. These entities were more sophisticated than simple guardians. They could evaluate complex situations and make decisions about how to respond to different types of intrusions. Archaeological evidence suggests that some early tomb explorers understood these spiritual hierarchies well enough to avoid serious supernatural consequences. European explorers of the 18th and early 19th centuries often employed local guides who knew traditional protective rituals and offering protocols. These expeditions experienced fewer curse-related incidents than later, more scientific explorations that ignored indigenous magical traditions. The innermost layer of protection was the pharaoh's own divine consciousness, which ancient texts describe as remaining active and aware within the tomb complex. This wasn't just a passive spiritual presence. It was portrayed as an intelligent entity capable of monitoring the tomb, evaluating threats, and taking direct action against violators. But the texts also describe circumstances under which even the pharaoh's consciousness might choose to spare intruders. Genuine scholars seeking knowledge, people who showed proper respect for Egyptian religious traditions, and individuals who approached the tomb with pure spiritual motivations might be allowed to enter, and even to remove certain artifacts without triggering supernatural retaliation. The key seemed to be intention and respect. The magical systems built into Egyptian tombs were apparently sophisticated enough to evaluate not just what people did, but why they did it. Tomb robbers motivated by simple greed would face the full force of the protective systems, while archaeologists or religious pilgrims with more elevated motivations might receive very different treatment. Several documented cases support this interpretation. Some archaeologists who approached Egyptian sites with genuine reverence and who made appropriate offerings to the ancient gods reported experiencing what they described as supernatural assistance rather than supernatural hostility. Their excavations would proceed unusually smoothly, they would make unexpected discoveries, and they would avoid the accidents and illnesses that plagued their less respectful colleagues. Howard Carter himself, despite his public skepticism about curses, privately adopted many traditional Egyptian protective practices. During his excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb, he made regular offerings at local shrines, employed workers who knew traditional protective rituals, and modified his excavation techniques to show greater respect for ancient religious protocols. While he experienced some supernatural difficulties, he avoided the fatal consequences that claim many of his colleagues. The protective entities described in Egyptian texts weren't just guardians, they were also teachers. The ancient sources suggest that properly prepared visitors could receive spiritual instruction, historical information, and even magical knowledge from the spirits that inhabited tomb complexes. This educational function was considered one of the most important aspects of the protective system. Some modern researchers have reported experiences that seem to match these ancient descriptions. Archaeologists working in Egyptian sites sometimes report receiving sudden insights about construction techniques, historical events, or religious practices that they couldn't have known through conventional research. While these experiences might be explained as intuition or unconscious pattern recognition, their consistency with ancient Egyptian accounts of spiritual instruction is remarkable. The ancient texts also describe protective rituals that could temporarily neutralize tomb defenses, allowing necessary maintenance, legitimate research, or religious ceremonies to be conducted without supernatural interference. These rituals were complex and required extensive knowledge of Egyptian magical traditions, but they suggest that the curse systems were designed to be manageable rather than absolute. Understanding these protective hierarchies helps explain why some people seem immune to curse effects, while others are severely affected. The ancient Egyptian magical systems weren't indiscriminate supernatural weapons. They were sophisticated spiritual technologies designed to distinguish between different types of human consciousness and motivations. Modern visitors to Egyptian sites who approach them with genuine respect, appropriate offerings, and sincere interest in learning about ancient Egyptian culture often report having remarkably positive experiences, even in locations notorious for curse activity. This suggests that the protective systems described in ancient texts may still be functioning according to their original design parameters. Hidden within the most elaborate pharaohs' tombs were chambers that were sealed not to protect treasure, but to contain knowledge and spiritual forces that the ancient Egyptians considered too dangerous for any human consciousness to encounter. These forbidden chambers, when they have been discovered and opened, have been associated with some of the most disturbing supernatural incidents in the history of archaeology. The tomb of Seti I, one of the most magnificent burial complexes in the Valley of the Kings, contains a chamber that has never been fully excavated, despite being discovered over 2 centuries ago. Early explorers who attempted to enter this chamber reported experiencing immediate psychological effects, overwhelming fear, disorientation, and the sense that they were being watched by hostile intelligence. The chamber contains wall decorations unlike anything else found in Egyptian tombs. Instead of the usual religious scenes showing the pharaoh's journey through the afterlife, the walls are covered with what appear to be instruction manuals for advanced magical practices. The hieroglyphic texts describe techniques for consciousness transfer, methods for communicating with entities from other dimensions, and procedures for manipulating what the Egyptians called the fabric of reality itself. The few scholars who have studied these texts in detail have reported experiencing psychological symptoms that seem to worsen the more they understand about what they're reading. Several Egyptologists have abandoned their research on this chamber after reporting nightmares, hallucinations, and the sense that they were being spiritually attacked by the knowledge they were attempting to decode. The tomb of Akhenaten, the heretical pharaoh who attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion, contains what may be the most dangerous forbidden chamber ever discovered. This chamber was deliberately destroyed by Akhenaten's successors, but enough remains to suggest that it contained materials related to his attempts to contact what he called the hidden god, a deity that apparently existed outside the normal Egyptian pantheon. The fragmentary texts that survive from this chamber describe Akhenaten's experiments with what modern researchers would recognize as consciousness-altering techniques. He apparently developed methods for entering trance states that allowed him to communicate with spiritual entities that provided him with a technological and magical knowledge far in advance of his time. These experiments may have been more successful than anyone realized. Some of the artifacts found in Akhenaten's tomb show technological sophistication that historians can't explain through conventional understanding of ancient Egyptian capabilities. More disturbing, the chamber seems to have retained some form of spiritual contamination that affects anyone who spends extended time studying its remains. Dr. Barry Kemp, who has spent decades studying Akhenaten's city of Amarna, has documented numerous incidents of psychological disturbance among team members working on sites connected to the heretical pharaoh. Team members report experiencing what they describe as mental intrusions, thoughts and images that seem to come from outside their own consciousness and that contain information about ancient Egyptian religious practices that they couldn't have known through normal research. The tomb of Ramesses VI contains a chamber that was sealed with warnings so severe that even ancient Egyptian priests were forbidden to enter it. The chamber was discovered by Giovanni Belzoni in 1817, but he sealed it again after spending only a few minutes inside. His private journals, which weren't published until decades after his death, describe an experience that terrified one of the most fearless tomb explorers of his era. According to Belzoni's account, the chamber contained not just wall decorations, but 3-dimensional installations that seemed to move and change when observed directly. He described seeing carved figures that appeared to turn their heads to follow his movements, hieroglyphic texts that seemed to rewrite themselves as he watched, and architectural features that appeared to extend far beyond the physical boundaries of the chamber. Modern attempts to re-enter this chamber have been largely unsuccessful. Electronic equipment fails consistently in the area. Surveying instruments give impossible readings. Even experienced archaeologists report feeling overwhelming psychological pressure that makes extended work in the chamber impossible. The forbidden chambers aren't just dangerous to explore, They seem to be designed to remain active indefinitely. Unlike normal tomb chambers, which show signs of deterioration and environmental damage, these sealed spaces often appear to be in perfect condition, despite being closed for thousands of years. The preservation is so complete that some researchers have suggested the chambers exist in some form of temporal stasis that prevents normal aging and decay. Perhaps most disturbing are the chambers that appear to be larger inside than their external dimensions should allow. Several tombs contain chambers that violate basic principles of geometry with internal measurements that don't match external surveying data. These dimensional anomalies have been documented by multiple independent survey teams, but no one has been able to explain how ancient Egyptian architects could have created such structures. The texts found in these forbidden chambers often describe the rooms themselves as gateways or threshold spaces that connect the physical world to other dimensions of reality. According to these accounts, the chambers were designed not just as storage spaces, but as functional interfaces between different levels of existence. Some modern physicists who have studied these chambers have reported measurements that seem to support ancient Egyptian claims about dimensional manipulation. Dr. Hal Puthoff of the Institute for Advanced Studies has documented electromagnetic anomalies in several forbidden chambers that suggest the presence of what he calls exotic matter, materials that don't behave according to conventional physical laws. Whether these chambers contain genuine supernatural phenomena or represent ancient technological achievements that modern science doesn't yet understand, they clearly represent the most advanced and dangerous aspects of Egyptian magical engineering. The fact that they remain sealed and largely unstudied suggests that even modern archaeology recognizes the wisdom of the ancient warnings about knowledge that some human minds aren't equipped to handle. In recent decades, a new breed of researcher has emerged, scientists and investigators who specifically seek out reportedly cursed Egyptian artifacts and sites, using modern technology to study supernatural phenomena that conventional archaeology prefers to ignore. Their findings have been both fascinating and deeply disturbing, suggesting that ancient Egyptian magical systems may be more sophisticated and effective than mainstream academia is willing to acknowledge. Dr. Maurice Cotterell, a British engineer and researcher, spent years using advanced electromagnetic detection equipment to study Egyptian pyramids and tombs. His investigations revealed complex patterns of electromagnetic activity that seem to correspond with areas where supernatural phenomena have been reported. Most significantly, he documented electromagnetic signatures that appear to respond to human presence in ways that suggest some form of intelligent control. Cotterell's work in the Great Pyramid revealed electromagnetic patterns that seem to shift and change when people enter different chambers. The patterns aren't random. They appear to follow specific sequences that match mathematical principles found in ancient Egyptian religious texts. More disturbing, the patterns seem to intensify around people who show emotional responses to the pyramid environment, as if the electromagnetic systems were designed to interact with human consciousness. The International Institute for Anomalous Phenomena has conducted extensive research on reportedly cursed Egyptian artifacts using some of the most advanced scientific equipment available. Their studies have documented consistent patterns of unusual electromagnetic, thermal, and acoustic activity around objects removed from Pharaohs' tombs. Dr. Stefan Schwartz, the Institute's Director of Research, has documented cases where Egyptian artifacts seem to affect the behavior of sensitive electronic equipment in ways that can't be explained through conventional physics. Computers malfunction when processing images of certain artifacts. Recording equipment produces unexplained audio anomalies when used near cursed objects. Even simple electronic devices like digital watches and calculators show erratic behavior in the presence of certain Egyptian antiquities. Perhaps most significantly, the Institute has documented what they call consciousness effects, measurable changes in brain activity, heart rate, and other biological functions in people exposed to reportedly cursed artifacts. These effects are most pronounced in people who understand the historical and religious significance of the objects they're examining. The research team led by Dr. Robert Temple, author of several books on ancient mysteries, has used ground-penetrating radar and other advanced imaging techniques to study sealed chambers in Egyptian tombs. Their work has revealed the existence of numerous hidden chambers that don't appear on any ancient plans or modern archaeological surveys. More disturbing, some of these hidden chambers appear to contain structures that don't match conventional understanding of ancient Egyptian architecture. The radar signatures suggest the presence of chambers with impossible geometries, rooms that appear to be larger than the spaces containing them, passages that seem to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the tomb complex, and architectural features that change configuration between different scanning sessions. Dr. James Hurtak, a researcher who combines conventional archaeology with consciousness studies, has documented numerous cases of what he calls informational downloading during visits to Egyptian sites. Researchers working with his team report receiving sudden insights about ancient Egyptian religious practices, architectural techniques, and historical events that they couldn't have known through conventional study. These insights often prove to be historically accurate when checked against newly discovered texts or archaeological evidence. The researchers describe the experience as similar to accessing a database of ancient knowledge that seems to be somehow encoded in the sites themselves. The Consciousness Research Laboratory at Princeton University conducted a series of experiments using reportedly cursed Egyptian artifacts as focal points for studies of human consciousness and perception. Their results suggested that certain ancient Egyptian objects do indeed affect human consciousness in measurable ways. Participants in the studies showed consistent changes in brainwave patterns when exposed to specific artifacts, particularly those removed from royal tombs. The changes weren't random. They followed patterns that seemed designed to induce specific altered states of consciousness. More significantly, participants often reported receiving visual and auditory impressions that contained historically accurate information about ancient Egypt. Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, the controversial biologist who has proposed theories about morphic fields and morphic resonance, has suggested that ancient Egyptian magical practices may have created what he calls information fields that can persist for thousands of years. According to his theory, the intense ritual activity conducted in Egyptian tombs could have created permanent alterations in the quantum field structure around these sites. These information fields could theoretically affect human consciousness in ways that would be interpreted as supernatural phenomena. People entering areas with strong morphic resonance might experience memories, emotions, and knowledge that don't belong to their own personal experience, but that derive from the accumulated spiritual activity of thousands of years. The advanced technology used by modern curse hunters has also revealed evidence that suggests ancient Egyptian architects may have understood and deliberately manipulated natural forces that modern science is only beginning to recognize. Sites with strong curse reputations often show unusual patterns of geomagnetic activity, underground water flow, and geological stress that could affect human consciousness and health in subtle but measurable ways. Whether these natural factors explain supernatural phenomena or whether ancient Egyptian priests understood how to enhance and direct natural forces for magical purposes, the evidence suggests that Egyptian magical sites were far more sophisticated than conventional archaeology has assumed. Recent developments in quantum physics and consciousness research have begun to provide theoretical frameworks that could explain how ancient Egyptian magical systems might actually function as described in historical accounts. While these explanations remain highly speculative, they suggest that the pharaohs' curses might involve genuine manipulation of fundamental forces rather than simple psychological suggestion. Dr. Dean Radin of the Institute of Noetic Sciences has conducted extensive research on what he calls field effects of consciousness, measurable ways that human awareness seems to influence physical systems at the quantum level. His experiments have demonstrated that focused human intention can affect random number generators, radioactive decay rates, and other quantum processes in ways that suggest consciousness has direct causal power over physical reality. If consciousness can indeed affect quantum systems, then the ancient Egyptian practices of focused intention, prolonged ritual activity, and deliberate cultivation of specific mental states could theoretically create lasting alterations in the quantum field structure around tomb sites. The pharaohs and their priests spent years preparing for death with the explicit intention of maintaining active consciousness beyond physical life, a process that might create genuine quantum-level changes in the environment. The concept of quantum entanglement, the demonstrated ability of quantum particles to affect each other instantaneously across vast distances, provides another possible mechanism for curse effects. Objects removed from Egyptian tombs might remain quantum entangled with the tomb environment and the consciousness systems built into it, allowing the tomb's magical defenses to affect artifacts and people far from the original site. Dr. Harold Puchhoff, a physicist who has worked with both government remote viewing programs and private consciousness research organizations, has proposed that consciousness might operate through what he calls zero-point field interactions. According to this theory, human awareness interfaces with the quantum vacuum in ways that could allow properly trained consciousness to influence events across both space and time. The ancient Egyptian priests claimed to possess techniques for projecting consciousness beyond the physical body and for maintaining awareness after death. If consciousness does indeed interface with quantum fields, as Puchhoff suggests, then these ancient practices might have involved genuine manipulation of fundamental physical forces rather than simple religious belief. Dr. Russell Targ, another physicist involved in consciousness research, has documented numerous cases of what he calls remote viewing, the ability of trained individuals to gather accurate information about distant locations through consciousness alone. Some of his most successful subjects have been able to provide detailed descriptions of archaeological sites they had never visited, including accurate information about hidden chambers and buried artifacts. If remote viewing represents a genuine phenomenon rather than coincidence or fraud, then the ancient Egyptian claims about consciousness operating independently of physical location become more plausible. The pharaohs might have developed sophisticated techniques for projecting awareness that allowed them to monitor their tombs and influence events within them even after physical death. The quantum mechanical concept of observer effect, the demonstrated fact that the act of observation affects the behavior of quantum systems, provides yet another possible mechanism for supernatural phenomena. If consciousness does indeed affect quantum systems through observation, then the focused attention of ancient Egyptian practitioners could have created permanent alterations in the quantum properties of tomb environments. Dr. Amit Goswami, a quantum physicist who has written extensively about consciousness and quantum mechanics, has proposed that consciousness is fundamental to physical reality rather than being produced by it. According to his interpretation of quantum mechanics, consciousness doesn't emerge from matter. Matter emerges from consciousness. If Goswami's interpretation is correct, then the ancient Egyptian emphasis on consciousness development, spiritual training, and mental discipline makes perfect sense as practical preparation for manipulating physical reality through direct conscious control. The pharaohs might have been literally true when they claimed divine power over the material world. The quantum physics concept of non-locality, the demonstrated ability of quantum systems to exhibit correlations that transcend normal spatial and temporal boundaries, could explain how ancient Egyptian magical systems might continue operating thousands of years after their creation. Quantum systems that were entangled during the original ritual activity could theoretically maintain their connections indefinitely.